Is it normal to sit or stand?
It's sort of for you to sit.
Probably
so
easier.
we're streaming it, so
Okay.
It's sort of adjusted for sitting. But if you want to stand,
No, I
can
prefer to sit.
readjust it. Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that was the normal thing to do.
So, thank you everyone for coming. I will just briefly introduce our guest speaker, Sarah and Pike, a professor of comparative religion at the State University of Chico. Sarah's specialization was Burning Man for a long time, pagan studies, correct me if I'm saying it wrong, ritual, public festivity, but the lecture is going to be about climate protests, so that I suppose is another field of yours which you're looking into at this moment. Yes, she has written numerous books and articles, and we're very glad that you came. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for joining us when you're not quite back in session yet. But I really want to thank Martin and Olga for a wonderful couple of days at our gathering on Ritual and Festival, and it's really been a pleasure to be in Prague. I've never been here before, so really a really beautiful city, and I've been enjoying it. You as well. Yes. All right. So this slide is the Red Rebel Brigade. They were very involved in climate protests in 2019 as part of Extinction Rebellion. I don't know if you had that here in Prague as well, but I know it's all over. We had them in Velvet Carnival as well. Ah, interesting. So I'm going to say a little bit more about them specifically later, but that's sort of becoming the focus of my research on climate protests. But I'm really only starting. I mean, of course, everything shut down in 2020.
Sorry, just, yeah.
Where's the
arrow? Click on the
arrow, yeah. Okay. This is just a quote from their website to kind of orient us a bit as I start to talk. This is my sort of small case, then I'm going to back out again to look at the larger issues that I've been involved with researching. But I wanted to just highlight a couple of things from their statement of purpose here. We are unity and we empathize with our surroundings. This idea of empathizing with others, I'll talk about a little bit. We divert, distract, delight, and inspire the people who watch us. The idea of influencing those who are watching a protest is a really important part of what I want to argue about how ritualization functions in these climate protests. All right, so I'm going to back out to a more kind of contextualized approach. I was involved with this research project, Reassembling Democracy, Ritual as Cultural Resource. It was a 5-year project running from 2013 to 2019, so right about when the climate protests that wave of climate protests really got underway. It was based in Oslo, but it involved researchers from around the world. I've listed the countries there that we came from. I think I was the only one from the US. A lot of Europeans, but really folks from all over. The case studies included those countries as well as Turkey, India, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Hong Kong. So really quite a lot of diverse case studies. And we were a multidisciplinary group. The majority were in theology or religious studies, but we had a number of anthropologists, a political scientist, a couple of sociologists as well. And we were really looking at the ways in which ritual doesn't only kind of mobilize and promote society's values, but how rituals might contribute to how societies change. And that was kind of our broader question. Can they contribute? And really we were looking in a positive way, and we can talk maybe about how rituals might help societies change in more negative directions as well. But we wanted to try to understand if these ritual activities can expand democratic processes. So that was part of the focus, and I just realized I should check the time. Okay. Oops. This isn't a full list, but here's a list of some of the topics, some of the case studies that we looked at. And I just wanted to give you a kind of idea of the spread. There were quite a few on festivals, a number of them on protests, including my own. I really focused on environmental protests more generally, not climate protests for this project. That came a little bit later, about a year later. And I'm just going to give you a brief taste of a couple of the other case studies besides my own that I found particularly interesting and provocative. This one was from 2013 in Istanbul. It was a study by a sociologist, Agnes Zajda, and she was really looking at what happened after these protests in the Gezi Park. I don't remember if any of you remember hearing about it, but the government in Istanbul wanted to tear down the park, basically. It was one of the only green spaces they had in the city, and people were very upset about this, so they occupied the park, and really a kind of cross-section of people from many different backgrounds, not all of them political before this. And then the police came in and basically cleared everyone out. A number of people were injured over this time period. You can see the kind of sense of violence in that. And so after this, Agnes was looking at some of the ritualization that took place, and she was focusing on this specific ritual, which is an iftar, which is a feast that Muslims hold after sundown and during the month of Ramadan. So they fast during the day, and then at sundown they have a feast. And this iftar took place in different spots around the city, but it was not just Muslims, but many people came. They brought their food, and they basically created this feast in the middle of the streets as a protest. And so at the same time that they're kind of eating and gathering for food, to share food, they're also chanting, and you can't see any signs here, but kind of, chanting kind of anti-government, anti-repression during this. So one of the reasons I picked this case to show you from our larger project is that one of the themes really became this configuration of public spaces into spaces of protest, and sometimes really sacred spaces of protest, and what that might mean we can talk about. This is the other case that I wanted to just briefly show you. Again, not my own research, but one of the researchers in our larger project. This was led by Jonas Salmonsen, who is a theologian in the Theological Studies School at the University of Oslo. And it was about commemorating the 22nd of July, which is the big tragedy in Norway in 2011, when the right-wing extremist, the racist terrorist killed a number of Norwegians, but the majority of them young people, high school students and college students. He went to an island where the young Social Democrats were gathering. These would be the young leaders, very multicultural party. A lot of them, second-generation immigrants to Norway, and so it was very symbolic that he specifically targeted them. So afterwards, there was an outpouring of people bringing flowers to public spaces immediately after the terrorist attacks, and this became a kind of annual ritual. You might not think of it as a protest, but many Norwegians saw it not just as a commemoration, but a way of really protesting the rise of kind of right-wing fascism in Norway. And so there's another example of this, coming into these public spaces with flowers to commemorate and protest what had happened on their tragic day of 22nd of July. So again, really the kind of reconfiguration of public space, or the use of public space, to create some kind of new vision of a democratic society. And in this case, this was part of the Oslo Group's 22nd of July project. Interfaith funerals took place very intentionally. Muslim and Christians coming together to mourn the young people that had died, publicly really encouraging Norwegians to visualize a more multicultural society. Okay, so this is so those are two representative cases. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my own research for the project, which was on environmental activists. This was a protest against climate change, but more specifically the extraction of oil and gas from the land. And these activists, this is Portland, Oregon in the US, this bridge is the way that boats go out to the ocean, and they were trying to prevent an icebreaker from going out into the ocean and going up to the Arctic to break the ice so that they could drill for oil. So it was an anti-extraction protest. And what I'm interested in this kind of protest is what motivates people to do something like this, very precarious. I'm interested in the sort of image of activists' vulnerable bodies, because basically the idea here is the icebreaker can't get through without killing the activists. So that's an important part of the protest that I looked at, is the place of the activist body and the effect of that on people watching, the fact that it is dangerous and precarious, and the effect on the activists themselves as a kind of rite of passage or transformative experience. I also was looking at forest protests, where the same idea, the activists are sitting in the trees, they can't cut down the trees without killing the activists, so they've got to find a way to take them out. It delays logging. This one was in Florida. So I was interviewing and doing ethnographic research with these activists, and particularly interested in their sort of spiritual and religious views. Most of them were non-religious, but had very strong ideas about the earth as something sacred. And so I explored that in my book on this. So then after this project kind of ended, I really turned more to looking at the climate strikes of 2019 was when the Oslo-based project ended. And my book was done on the environmental activists, so I really turned to these climate protests, another kind of environmental activism. And as I'm talking to you about them, I'm really thinking about ritual with a couple of colleagues here and their work on ritual, Michael Hausman's article on relationality, on ritual as a distinctive way of enacting relationships. And then Ronald Grimes' really interesting essay, Performance is Currency in the Deep World's Gift Economy, an incantatory riff for a global medicine show. And that phrase, performance is currency in the deep world's gift economy, that's from an essay by Gary Snyder, who's a famous American poet, kind of nature poet. And in this essay, Snyder talks about performance, meaning ritual activities, as a kind of currency we ought to use to address our current environmental crises. So Grimes suggests that we should be trying to figure out what actions, rightly performed, whatever that might mean, might save the planet, and what even saving the planet would mean in this context. And these are a couple of quotes from Grimes that I'm working with in my study of climate protests. For attitudes to become definitive, they must be cultivated by practice. And the name for sustained, value-laden attitude practice is ritual. And then Grimes writes, ritual helps people figure out, divine, or even construct a cosmos. So here again, the idea of ritual is something that can be creative and constructive. And that's an important aspect of the protest that I'm looking at. Here's some of the themes that I've been finding in my research on climate protests. The presence and absence of youth. So the 2019 wave of climate protests was led by young people, high school students and college students for the most part, were really leading this particular environmental movement. I'm interested in how these experiences are described as rites of passage. Not going to talk a lot about that today, but it is a theme. This issue of vulnerable bodies, which I mentioned already. The diversity that's very publicly represented in youth-led climate protests, and the way that losses, both human and non-human, are made visible in these protests in a way that they might have been hidden before. Acts of identification, usually with non-human species. This notion of mourning the future as well as the present and the past is a theme that comes up a lot. And then finally, probably the most important issue that came out of the Oslo project was the way that public space is used, the way it's claimed and then redefined in a protest activity, and how it sometimes becomes what we might think of as sacred space. Okay. So everyone probably knows who this is. This is Greta Thunberg, who really sparked this recent wave of climate protests that was just shut down by COVID as it was, getting going. So in 2018, Greta Thunberg stood outside of the Swedish Parliament, and this is School Strike for Climate. And so here, this theme of students walking out of school, so skipping school, right, striking from school, walking out of school and into public spaces where they might not have been heard before. So you may know that Greta Thunberg also addressed the United Nations, a space that typically doesn't hear from teenagers. So I think this is a really interesting kind of movement from being absent in school, which is the sort of state-funded socialization of young people, to mean present in streets in a role of kind of resistance and rebellion. So this movement really grew. The next day there were a few people there, and then within about a month there were maybe 1 million people from all over the world, and I'm just going to list some of the countries. And again, these were young people leading climate strikes out of school into the streets. Australia, India, Greece, El Salvador, China, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Pakistan, the United States, Nigeria, and most European countries. And so they would walk out carrying signs like, save our future, you will die of old age, we will die of climate change, and other warnings like that. So I'm interested in how in these walkouts, and I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to you in the US, though the walkout is a common kind of labor activity usually, or protest activity by labor, a strike. And so the idea of young people striking for climate, I think, is really trying to tie in with this larger history of striking and walking out. And in the United States, it has a specific meaning with the civil rights movement, the kind of walking for social change, and there's lots of other examples, but I'd say the civil rights movement is one of the most prominent in American activist minds that they often identify, and that would be from way back in the 1950s and 1960s, where African Americans and their white supporters were marching and walking, and students were walking from segregated schools, or I shouldn't say that, say it that way, from black segregated schools to white segregated schools in an attempt to desegregate. So this history of students walking out, being sort of absent in schools and present in the streets, I think is a really important one. This is just one example of the youth-led climate protest. This one was in Lisbon, but looks pretty similar all over the world, carrying all kinds of banners and signs about climate change, protesting climate change. One of the interesting developments in the US, I don't know, most of my research is focused in the US, even though today I'm showing you examples from all over, is the increasing diversity of the youth-led movement. Typically in the US, environmentalism has been very white and criticized for being very white and not including people of color. And so this youth-led movement has been very explicitly trying to include young people of color, and they've really been stepping up to lead. This is Isra Hirsi. She's the daughter of Ilhan Omar. If you follow American politics at all, she is a Somali-American congresswoman, very much of an activist, very much on the progressive side of the Democratic Party. And this is her daughter, who is one of the executive directors of the US Youth Climate Strike. Here is another example just of the diversity here, really explicitly including indigenous youth in the US, which has all kinds of interesting meanings in this particular context. Hi, welcome. Oh, thank you for coming. And they're carrying the sign "Fridays for Future," which is one of the slogans of the climate strikes. All right, let me make sure I'm keeping on the time.
You're fine.
Yeah, but I don't. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I think that's, so I just really wanted to mention this as an example of the kind of visibility of diversity in public spaces associated with climate in this case. So here we have another theme about claiming public space. Anyone know anyone been to London recently? Look familiar? Yeah. This is the Westminster Lion. And
like
so,
a Czech lion, actually.
Really?
Yeah, we have it as a symbol of Czech lions.
Well, lions, of course. Yeah. So Westminster in London is the center of the British power, right? It's where the government buildings are. It's where a lot of tourists come. So this climate protest was really intentionally held at the center of UK power, and young people leaving schools, coming into the space, and really demanding to have a voice in public. So I've been thinking about these kinds of actions specifically that come into government spaces or spaces of power as these sort of interventions or ruptures in business as usual. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Let me give you another example. This was a protest in New York. This is Wall Street. This is the Wall Street Bull, very famous. Again, both a seat of power in the United States and a tourist attraction. The bull is, really a perfect symbol of capitalism, and that's what the activists are attacking here, pouring fake blood all over the bull, and then lying down. Again, here you really have that kind of image of the vulnerable bodies who are waiting to be arrested and taken away by the police. And I should say that I don't think I mentioned the kind of range of protests. You have marching in the streets, these kind of demonstrations, then you have more of a civil disobedience like this, where the intention is to get arrested, sometimes blocking roads. I'll show you a couple of examples of those. And then you have processions as well. So I'm really looking at a number of different public protests about climate change. So let me read you a couple of...
So does it mean that when you do such a thing, you get arrested very quickly?
Usually, at least in the United States. I don't know about elsewhere, but I think in the UK too. Sometimes I'm going to show you an example of where it's difficult to arrest the activists and take them away. In this case, they really wanted to be arrested to draw attention to their cause.
But isn't it like in most cases that the arrest is part of the
part of the plan.
performance? Yeah.
Part of the plan. They've got lawyers standing by. Yeah, part of the plan. Exactly. So this was a die-in, and the organizer said, "The blood of the world is here. A lot of blood has been spilled by the decisions of the powerful. The cost of these profits is the blood their money is soaked in." And so then that is, the reason that they're using blood to really bring attention to that, something that's often hidden, the bloody consequences of investment in oil and gas specifically. So then this theme of identifying between humans and other species, so a lot of the climate protests are about the future of humans, but they're also including other species and the natural world in general, and I think that's an really important aspect of it. This is a protest in Lima, Peru. These activists were protesting, and this was in 2020 before the pandemic really hit. They were protesting the Australian wildfires, and during those wildfires, the news was just coming out, it was really more and more horrific every day. 33 humans at this time, I'm sure that more died, but over 1 billion non-human animals had died, including some species that were really endangered or on the brink of extinction. So these activists are dressed as animals trying to stop traffic, and here this act of identification is a way of bringing attention to other species that wouldn't be in public spaces. So like young people in schools who come out in the streets, these are other species being represented in the streets, and really demanding that they should have moral consideration as well as humans should. So in these kinds of protests, these aren't happening, those weren't happening in Australia, they were in, Peru. These are in London. These kind of images of distant loss that we might read about in the media, but we don't necessarily see in our daily lives. So really wanting to bring the losses that might be hidden into visibility. This one is in Madrid. This was, again, and almost all of these are in 2019, which is when the climate protests were really at their height. And this was for the summit, the COP25, or the Conference of Parties, that was supposed to focus on the 2015 Paris climate meetings. And these activists are dressed in black. It's a kind of funeral procession for the dead and dying, including the future dead, the humans and animals that will be dead. And so I'm going to go just show you a few examples of this kind of approach, the mourning procession, which I think is particularly interesting. There were a number of funerals for animals. These were held in 2018 and 2019 in England, where again there's these acts of identification with other species, really explicitly bringing extinction of others into public space. And I'll just read you a quote from the organizers. This was planned as, quote, "a tribute to the thousands of insects, mammals, reptiles, and more who get confirmed as extinct each year. We have entered the 6th mass extinction event. We come together to mourn all the life we've lost, are losing, and are still to lose." And so this theme of mourning the future, this is the one example I have. I wasn't sure if there'd be some religious study students here or watching, but I thought I would just gesture towards the theme of faith groups that are involved with these particular protests. So this one was, let me get the name right, UK Extinction Rebellion Faith Groups 40 Days of Action for Lent. So it was the first, this one was in February 26th. I don't know if they got all their 40 days done before things were shut down. But this was faith groups, really an interfaith attempt to really focus on this, the death, the future and death.
So this happened at the beginning of Lent? There was an explicit connection with...
explicit connection with Lent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there something else outside of just saying it's at the beginning of Lent? Or?
I don't know. They have, I know they did a bunch of different rituals with those 40 days, but I didn't look at this in depth. I really just wanted to put it up there as an example. But that's a really good question that will be worth finding out. I'm guessing yes, but I don't know exactly what, because this one, obviously, it's not a really close connection. Yeah. All right, this is for you, Martin. All this mourning and funerals and commemoration really ignores the fact that humor plays a big part in these protests, and it's not something that I've really focused on, although I think since our discussion over the last couple of days, it's something that is really important. On the right, you see this kind of sign. There are so many examples of this. If you just look up humor at climate protests, you'll see just dozens of signs with various kind of funny statements. But on the left here is Larry Bogad, and excuse me, he's the one with the red face there. This is his clandestine insurgent rebel clown army. So Larry is a professor of performance studies at University of California, Davis, which is right down the road from where I am, and he came to speak on campus, and I really like his work. These clowns go to climate protests and cause all kinds of trouble, and for fun, fun trouble, and lighten the atmosphere a bit. So I think we have time. I'd like to show
So
you.
does this mean that somebody else organizes the climate protest and the clowns come as a separate unit, not connected to the organizers?
Both. Like sometimes the organizers might know about them and invite them, or sometimes they might just show up. Because a lot of these protests, quite a few were organized by Extinction Rebellion, but they tend to be lots of small groups that will bring people, so there isn't always a very official structure. So I know that sometimes they've been invited and sometimes they've just shown up.
And they sort of interact with, or do they interact somehow with the event itself in the sense that...
They interact with protesters. I've also seen them interact with police. Larry did a great presentation when he showed some of them going up to these cops with their, kind of, well, I guess in the US they've got their
armor,
guns and their armor and their helmets, and kind of coming up and playing with them, and the cops trying not to smile. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, he's got a whole book on this. Can't think of the name of it right now, but it's about this particular kind of protest strategy, kind of bringing humor and the unexpected into it. And I think that the Red Rebel Brigade, not with humor so much, but with the kind of somberness, does something similar in really messing with people's expectations of what a protest is, not just a bunch of folks up there yelling and giving speeches. So I don't know how to, I'm not good at saying this.
No, just, you should, it's not a touch screen, sorry. Just, yeah, it should work.
Yeah, it's because I've been, just a 2-minute video of, it's one of their first protests in 2019 about climate change. The group had been around before. Speaking of humor. Let's see. Back.
Is it embedded in the presentation or?
Well, I don't know. Just to see if I can get to my next. See if I go back. No. I keep trying to. Yeah, where is this?
Oh, sorry.
I don't usually show videos, so there we go.
So we want to go to
Yep,
this
that
one, right?
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, Martin. So that just gives you an idea of one of the kinds of things that the Red Rebel Brigade is doing. And that was one of their first actions, as I said, and it was kind of the beginning of their presence, not just in the UK, but in Europe and in the United States as they kind of spread. And it was a grassroots movement, so people could basically start their own, and they had to, follow some basic, one of the basic principles was silence, so no speaking. And I'll just read you a little bit more from the Red Rebel Brigade slides to kind of give you a sense, again, of some of the themes that I've been touching, and then I'll conclude. Who are we? We are your blood, the blood of our planet, the blood of all extinguishing species. We mourn our losses now to help you awaken. And then the founder of the Red Rebel Brigade explained sort of his idea in this way. And this is a quote from Doug Francisco. He's based in the UK. They're like spirits coming back from beyond the grave, here to warn the living of the grave errors they're making. A beautiful bloody mob of nightmarish bodies pleading with us not to destroy ourselves. So in this, you have kind of a very different kind of protest that they were involved in. This was at the Waterloo Bridge. This was a road blockade. The activists who were not Red Rebel Brigade, they were locked down. That's a lockbox there. She has her arm in it in a way that it's really not easy to get across. And the police were standing around. You can't see them. They really didn't know what to do. They were like, and then people were coming. They wanted to drive through. They couldn't get through. People were getting angry. And the Red Rebel Brigade kind of came in just to offer support for this action. I haven't seen any examples of them doing any civil disobedience. They tend to do these processions and then support the actions that are happening. And then one last slide. This was a recent one. I was really curious to see what they started to get active again as things are opening up a bit. This was in Poland and England, kind of anti-logging, protect our forests, Earth Day observation or commemoration or celebration, however you might want to see that. So just to conclude, and then I would really love to hear your questions and critiques. I think that framing protests as ritual activity helps us understand more deeply the ways in which they work, how they work on the participants themselves in terms of the emotions they might feel, the experiences they might go through, on the observers that are watching them, and on the public spaces where they take place. Climate protests make visible those that are often hidden from spaces of power or the public realm, thus increasing democratic participation. Maybe I put a question mark there, I'm still not really sure about that. Of youth, of other species, of people of color in this movement. Climate protests both express and construct relationships, and this is kind of going back to the ritual definitions I gave you in the beginning about the ways that ritualized activities can create and construct ideals and moral values and relationships among humans and between humans and non-humans, including by mourning the present and future dead through these acts of identification and vulnerability. All right, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
I'd love to get some reactions.
Well, first I have a question. So there were 19 scholars, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or from 19 countries?
19 scholars.
Right.
I mean, there was like a few from the UK, a few from Norway.
Did you coordinate the research somehow? I mean, like, did
So-
you attend the same events, or did you
Oh, yeah,
split
good
them?
question.
Or-
No, it was actually really wonderful. What we did is we had 6 meetings in different parts of the world. South Africa, Berkeley, outside of Paris, 2 meetings in Norway, and London. And so the whoever was local, the South Africans hosted the South Africa meeting
Right.
in KwaZulu-Natal, and then the Norwegians, the Oslo meeting, then I hosted the Berkeley meeting with some scholars at University of California, Berkeley, and GTU, the theological school in Berkeley, and then, so each time we met, we had different hosts. And the Jonas Salmonsen was the principal investigator. She's University of Oslo based. So we had these different meetings, which were a lot of discussion in the beginning, and then really working on, after maybe the first 3 meetings, really kind of working on some writing projects. So we ended up with 2 books and a special issue of a journal about our research. Yeah, so 2 books. One really, the journal issue was on festivals and pilgrimage, and the other books were really on kind of ritual and democracy issues, different cases. Yeah, the different cases. And then there were some monographs like mine that came out as well.
Yeah, I always keep thinking, and it's also in relation to carnivals, but generally to protests, like how so it's a democratic expression in the sense that you're free to sort of go outside in the public space and express your opinion. In that sense, it is sort of a democratic mechanism, and obviously that's playing its part. I always keep wondering how effective they are,
Yeah.
right? For one, like the picture with the Red Brigade, and with the guy just sort of digging his hole
Or
regardless
just
of,
going on with their surfboard.
or just going on
Yeah.
with their surfboard.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously there was a beach full of people who didn't really care that there's a group of red, clad people with white faces because they're disturbing the
Right.
holiday, right? So I just wonder how effective these things are, and if and the first sentence or like framing protests as ritual activity helps us understand more deeply how they work. I think like, if we could talk about that,
Yeah.
because I keep thinking about how it explains it. If you can actually frame it as ritual, there obviously is a lot of symbolical language or the bull, right? That was very
Yeah.
that's a very strong
Right.
usage of the symbol. But I'm still not sure
Yeah.
about the effectiveness of
Right.
protests.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure either, so I'm going to give you some examples because this question always comes up. And especially, I would say Michael Hausman is like
Yeah.
always pushing on it. So I've been answering it for a long time. And well, the first answer is who knows? Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a number of possibilities. So one is I'm interested in how individuals themselves are affected. So in my research on environmental activists, I traced quite a few of them. I mean, I guess it was about over a period of 10 years, although the active research was 6 years. What happened to them when they left activism? What do they do with their lives? And one of the things I found is that most of them, if they weren't protesting anymore, which most of them weren't, they get burned out, they were working on organic farms, they were involved in political organizations, they were still kind of doing the same work. And then the other thing, I saw a book just came out on Occupy, which I think also kind of answers this question. And what he found, I think it's a journalist, maybe he's an academic, I can't think of his name right now. But, and I haven't read it, I just saw that, the main finding, which I saw in my research, was that many of the people from the Occupy movement moved horizontally, went into other movements, different kinds of protest or political activity. So there's that so there's the effect on the individuals and the actions they do in their lives. Then there's the effect on observers. I think that one is difficult. I haven't done enough research. I've done a little bit of research, not on climate protests, but on the environmental protests that I was involved with. And it really was a mix. Sometimes observers were really moved by these vulnerable bodies that to ask, why would somebody do this? They're just crazy. Well, if they're not crazy, why are they doing this? And then they might find out, oh, they're going to start fracking in the forest next to my farm, right? Fracking for oil, so hydrofracking, so going in and breaking up the sediments to get the oil, which is really environmentally destructive for the surrounding area. Like people's farms get polluted, their drinking water and all of that. So I'm just giving you some kind of, so sometimes the other thing happens with observers that I also found in my research is people get really angry because they can't get to work. What are those stupid, teenagers without any jobs? What are they doing so it can have the negative effect. So there's that. The people on the beach, of course, I wasn't there. I found video, but I do wonder, some of them might have been pissed off that what's going on with their holiday. But some of them might have wondered, who are those people dressed in red? And maybe it made them think. And I mean, I think that the protests that are more spectacle make people stop and wonder if they're not just getting pissed off because, I mean, in this case, they weren't really, it took, it probably was 20 minutes. It wasn't I think the road blockades are more controversial in terms of their effectiveness. So those are just, in terms of effectiveness, yeah, it's really hard to tell. I think bringing awareness to these issues, bringing awareness to the extinction, the kind of constant extinction, may shift people's thinking some to the longer term, the longer durée to really, but I don't know the answer to that. My ethnographic research was really more on the communities and individuals involved, not so much on the effectiveness in their lives and what that might mean for their communities and for their individual lives. But the question of political efficacy is constantly debated by these activists. In terms of what strategies, that's why I think humor, a lot of people believe that the kind of humor and performance is much more effective than the lockdowns, but not everyone.
This is what I was thinking about, is with this perspective that framing protests as ritual activities. This is actually what we do with Velvet Carnival.
Right. And you have similar issues that
actually, we somehow practically try to do this. If we had last for 2 years the Extinction Rebellion as well.
Yeah.
So actually, what we did with them was we tried their protests to transform more in a ritual way, to think about the symbols they are using, how to perform the protest, not in this black-white way, but more performing, actually. And
do you want to turn it off?
No. I'll turn this off. So sorry, go on.
No, it's just that actually this.
Does that say? Oh yeah, it's safe. That's a perfect toy.
Thank you.
Oh, of course, thank you. It's a great toy.
No, it's just this is what we actually tried with the groups who are mostly. This was the first idea, or one of the ideas of Velvet Carnival, to help those protests to be more ritualized or more symbolical, more as well, because we have seen that if someone does a protest with using of humor and using of symbols, it has much better effect than without, if...
But how did you measure the effect? Talking to bystanders?
Right.
No, but I'm not trying to be...
No, but the thing is, it's if you do that, then you see the reactions by the activists very often. They are sort of frustrated by the fact that they're not capable of getting a straightforward message across, because it's once you make it once you get rid of the proclamative signs, for example, then you open up this field of interpretation, and you just don't want whales to die, right? So and you don't necessarily want people to start like disinterpreting what you're trying to show. You just want to show this. So it gets frustrated, or it gets frustrating for them. And then they get annoyed by the fact that we're sort of, yes, we're for example, you're pushing them to do something like this. But
Yeah.
but if you think about these performances or activities as rituals, like how does it help to sort of grasp them? Like what?
Well,
Is
yeah.
the whole thing a ritual,
Right.
or just part of it?
Yeah, so
or-
I think of it in a couple of different ways. One is there are a lot of what I would call ritualized activities with a certain ritual focus and intention. This would be like practicing before. This is the behind the scenes. So this is
Yeah.
one aspect where very specific a space is created that's kind of outside of daily life. You enter the space and then you have these experiences, which could be role playing. With the police are coming, they're gonna beat you, how do you act? And, with an activist like the policeman and the protester, and often these are very emotional kind of, and then there's a distinct end to those and leaving the space. So I think that's just one example of what I would say are these activities behind the scenes for the protests. But I think the protests themselves, not every protest, but many of them, there's the creation of a space that's kind of out of, is liminal, out of ordinary time and space, right? Where things can look different. And the activist goal is to create an ideal, what the kind of what if, what if the world looked like this? What if we cared about the future? What if our governments really paid attention? So I think that liminal space of the protest, and again, some are more so than others. Some are really intentional. Some involve cleansing the space before. It just depends. But I do think the way that space is used and created is very much in a kind of ritual format in a very traditional sense of the kind of separation, liminality, and then reincorporation, really to oversimplify it. Those are just some of the ways that I would see protests as rituals. I also think that idea of the liminal, that the way activists talk about it in my interviews, is of being transformed, of having this transformative experience within that liminal part. Now, they might go, again, does that change their lives? It might, or they might just go back to business as usual. So I think all of the questions about ritual experience that you might have in a more formal ritual can also be asked of participants in these events. Does that kind of answer?
Yeah, for me, if I may, something very important happens when you're part of this bigger group. Something happens with your sense of individuality. You sort of lose for the time being the sense of being just there for yourself with your personal agenda. This is the transformation moment. Suddenly you grow up. You become part of something bigger. The pull, the energy, something is happening there that's very close to the main sensation of ritual for me.
That's a really good example. I think, because I didn't talk about it here, but one of the aspects of that liminal stage would be this feeling of communitas, or unity, which is what you're describing, of being one with the group. And you saw a little bit of that in the quote I read. But I think that's a really important way that the participants will talk about it afterwards. It's not just their individual experience, but that feeling of being part of this community of others that shared this experience.
Yeah, definitely. This braveness that you have to show in face of police or any kind of authorities that can stand against you. If you were there just for yourself, you could hardly stand as much. But as part of the group,
together. Yeah.
something from this small fear of I'm just one little alone is being lost to that moment. Very liminal experience.
Yeah. One of the interesting dynamics that I saw that I wrote about in my book on environmental activists, and I'm sure it happens with the climate protests, was that in my field work, all of these sort of behind the scenes activities, there was a lot of tension and conflict between people, between activists and groups, between individuals, between groups that had to do with gender issues and transphobia and racism and all kinds of issues in the activist communities that were involved. But then when they came to the protest site, they were all united in those moments. I mean, it was, and just the way they talked about it, against the police, against the politicians. So it was a really interesting dynamic to move from these other behind the scenes spaces into the, I don't know if that happens with the Velvet Carnival as well, but maybe not. But that very much in the protests that when I did the really in-depth interviews, which I haven't done with the climate protests yet, but I expect it's pretty similar.
Right, so the conflict, the conflict is intentional, that is part of the dynamic.
I don't think it's intentional. I think their ideal is they shouldn't be always fighting, but they do, in fact. I think it's part of the dynamic of the kind of a democratic, difficult struggle of a democratic process where you're trying to listen to all the voices and trying to be inclusive, and you have people with very different agendas. So I think it is, in a way, I mean, they wouldn't say it's intentional.
So you would see the democratic protest happening before the event itself, or?
Well, I would see both. I mean, if we think of democratic participation, trying to include many different voices, processes of decision making, I'd see it in both. I mean, in the context of the protest, it's really demanding a voice in the political process and a voice for the non-human, and a voice for humans that are often disenfranchised or marginalized. So, yeah. So both, I think, would be. Yeah.
And okay, and if one thinks about these events as rituals, then one thinks about the cosmology that is behind those rituals, because most often there is some
one thinks about what?
Cosmology.
Cosmology, yeah.
Because obviously rituals are a means of, or one of their
Right.
functions are a means of performative enacting or interacting with
A world.
with worlds.
Right.
And obviously, well, that's the thing, right? So, did you, like, how was that part of the research as well? Because okay, these are activists, ecological activists. We sort of people sort of have a pre-understanding of ecological activism.
Yeah.
But how, like, was
Or
that
they
part
acquired
of the
in the
research?
process of the action. They don't always. Sometimes they end up there because their friend says, let's go do this protest.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if I really want to go. Oh, come on, it'll be fun. You know, so, I mean, they may not have an idea, but they may develop an idea when they're there. Or in my research, some people when they're there are like, I don't want any part of this, you know, but others really get drawn into the ideal and the cosmology that they experience as part of that.
So you've used some extensive examples of this cosmology making on the spot as well?
Some examples, I don't know about extensive, some examples from individuals, of being, well, I should say not in the climate protests, but more in the tree sits where people are in these trees for days, not just a few, well, many of these they were there for a day or an afternoon. But when people are at a protest for a week, 2 weeks, they're part of a community, they're up in a tree, they're blockading a road, and they're really immersed in it. And often these protests, unlike the climate protests, happen in the forest or they happen in some rural area, not in the city. So they're different in that sense, but I'm guessing, I just haven't done the field work with the climate protests because everything shut down as I was getting started. But with the other kinds of protests, I have lots of stories of people becoming activists during that experience. Like they all got there for different reasons, but then this sense of becoming an activist with a capital A or whatever happens in that process. And what all those meanings and what that world is and what those relationships in that world are that are the kind of ideal relationships with moral value, all of that is kind of happening within the the experience at the protest. So I'm guessing some of that happens with the climate protest too, but I don't really know. Does that make sense? Kind of my previous research, which was a little bit different than this.
Because if you compare it to the Burning Man,
Yeah.
there isn't an open agenda like that, or is there an open? Oh, there is an open agenda, or okay. So the climate protests are sort of agendized, right?
Yes.
You're expecting them to say certain things.
Yes.
Whereas with the Burning Man, you're not expecting an agenda, more or less. Like there are people doing.
You're right, more or less, but I think that the Burning Man, like the organization and the leadership and the people that are not even officially leaders but are really prominent figures or charismatic figures in the movement, they have a shared agenda that's about creating an alternative world that's really not that different from what is in the climate protests. It would be, anti-capitalist, which is ironic, given that, but anyway, it's another topic. Anti-capitalist, diverse, recognizing the non-human. I mean, there'd be a lot of similarities, but it's less explicit and less narrow than the climate protests. So I think you're right, there is more of an openness of possibility for kind of negotiation.
But I was wondering, and my question was, so even though you say there's this narrower agenda which is defined with the climate protests, when you're there, you have a feeling that it's much wider, because
yes,
what
right.
you
No,
see
that's true.
Yeah. What you see are medialized versions of the protest, and what they would typically do is they take the most extreme situations, and that's what you put in the newspapers.
Yeah.
But precisely, like I don't normally see people having a common breakfast in newspapers when it comes down to a climate protest, right? So it's like how, and also the interaction with the media, like how that is mediated. But did you have time to look at that, or someone?
Just a little bit. I mean, a lot of these groups have specifically trained media people.
Right, okay.
That go, and they actually, and sometimes they even will encourage them to look. I mean, obviously, the media makes up their own minds about what they're going to look at, and they do tend to pick the more sensational stuff. But they often do have, there's a name for them I'm not thinking of, but anyway, a person or a group, depending on how large the protest is, that's responsible for media outreach and for getting their message across about what their agenda is, and whether it's to try to get their specific government to make more aggressive changes to deal with the climate crisis, which is usually what it is in these cases, to really recognize that government inaction is just making the situation worse. But so yeah, a little bit. I spent a little bit of time talking to media folks and kind of what their role is, and kind of watching what they do. There usually are specific people that interface with law enforcement as well. But the media, I think, they tend to focus on the person at the top of the tree, or they tend to focus at the person lying on the ground. And actually, a lot of the really interesting activity is happening on the street. And I'm thinking even of like the big climate march in New York, 2012, that I went to, and I was with the religious groups, right? And so what the media showed was they had this this ark with Christians, Muslims, and Jews on it, and it was very sort of spectacular with this is like a float that on wheels that was moving along. But then there were all of these other groups that didn't really get any immediate attention, like they were all carrying banners, like the atheists, the pagans. I was walking with the pagans and the Unitarians. So, I mean, they just, maybe the pagans were pretty colorful, but the Unitarians, they didn't get any media attention for Unitarians, and the atheists did. I mean, it's just, so the arc, it's what you focus on, but in that march, of course, it was huge, so it would have been hard to cover a lot of it. But there were so many little things happening that didn't get attention. And I think, again, that often much of the work is behind the scenes, and you don't hear about that in the media. You don't hear about all the arguments and the negotiations and the practicing and the, so I don't know. I mean, is it helpful in terms of their effectiveness that the media just focuses on, you know, the most spectacular troublemaking aspects? Of course, they do tend to focus on humor. If you've got clowns and they're going up to the police, those shots will often make the newspaper. So I think that's interesting.
You must look for some photogenic moments.
Yeah, right.
That's like,
So yeah, I don't have a really good answer to that, except for the little bits of you know, interviews I've done with people that in the activist groups that are interfacing with media. But I think it's a really important question about the kind of coverage, what they cover, what they leave out. I mean, one thing that I think the media does tend to leave out is the non-human, and for a lot of the activists, that's a really important part. I mean, the media stories, not surprisingly, tend to focus on the human stories.
I was just wondering that you spoke a little about emotions playing an important part in the rituals, and I've noticed a little in the Czech environmental protests that there is a big concentration on grief. So you would say that this is an emotion which takes the most important part in the environmental protests, or is it?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really interested in the emotions, and in fact, in my book on radical environmentalists, each chapter is about a specific emotion that activists talk about as a motivating factor. So I have love and compassion and anger, and the last chapter is about grief. And it was probably the theme that came up the most with the activists as a kind of motivation to why they're out there doing this. I mean, anger, rage, that was a pretty big one too. Love was a big one, but grief was the one I heard most about. And I think with the climate protests, it also, I'm not sure with the question of how it motivates others outside of the groups, but a lot of the activists themselves talk about that as being the main reason they're out there, right? It's a way of dealing with their grief, or also grief was what motivated them to be there in the first place. So thank you for that question, because I think those emotions in my ethnographic research were the main reason that activists will say they came to a protest.
Or excitement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but that isn't typically what people talk about when you ask them after the fact. And mostly I was interviewing them after a protest, or before, but not during, because during I'm participating. Not, you know, can you answer a few questions while you're, So, but I think excitement is a huge part of it. I mean, when you go to these big ones, especially, there's an energy and...
Tie yourself to building that's...
Yeah. Well, there's fear too. I mean, I went to this one anti-fracking protest where the activists, they were at the top of this tripod, you know, which was way, I don't know, like twice as high as this room. And they're just, I mean, they had a harness on, but must have been a lot of fear involved with that. I mean, it was kind of exciting for the people watching. I don't know how exciting it was for the person at the top of the tripod. Maybe it was mostly fear.
We're standing on it?
Sitting, blocking a road. Yeah, so came down so that the trucks couldn't get through without destroying the blockade. Yeah, that excitement, sure. And depending on the protest, I mean, I don't know about the Red Rebel Brigade that we saw. I mean, I'm really excited about doing more research with them because they have a very explicit kind of religious and ritual approach.
They were very serene, not at all
I know.
angry.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of us excitement. Grief, I mean, you feel, I mean, they talk about it and then there's that sense of grief and mourning.
But then again,
serenity,
they seem to be rather older people.
Yep.
So,
on this video, but normally
not always.
Just I see in the news.
The Red Brigade.
Yeah.
I've seen all ages, but you're right. That one.
That one was clearly.
Yeah, but this is a good question because the statistics for the larger Extinction Rebellion would skew, I mean, they are all ages from young children to elders, but would skew younger maybe than the red. It's hard to say. I mean, I saw a group of them in Los Angeles that were more young, but I'm not sure. And I think the theater group, it's a theater performance group, the Invisible Circus, that started it. And I think some of them may have been older, but it may be now that it's spreading. I'm not, so I don't know. Yeah, but I think age is a really important category of analysis for me because I think that, I mean, my book really focuses on young people and kind of this experience as a rite of passage. So I'm really curious how then older people, especially in the climate protests, because they are such a wide range of ages. There's the youth-led movements, but then there are, participants are all ages. So I'd be curious, I will be curious to hear about that.
And the reason why they choose these quasi-military terms for their names.
I know.
Brigade.
Yeah, and for something that's very
or-
unmilitary-like.
Precisely, so
Yeah.
like, I don't know, is there
I don't know the reason. I don't know the reason. That's something I haven't found out yet. There's a little bit on the internet about them, but I haven't interviewed anybody in the Red Rover Brigade yet.
outside that it's a fight against,
Yeah.
it's a fight against.
Yeah, and why the clown army? I mean,
Sort
Yeah.
of,
well, I
that
think
sort of
the-
goes, yeah.
it's an appropriation of military terms and a kind of, remaking of them.
Ridicules the system, I guess,
Yeah.
in its core. Like if you have an army full of mismatching individuals, then
Yeah. Or people dressed in red veils. I mean, I think that, part of it is that juxtaposition between this idea of a brigade or an army and what they're actually doing, which is not very army-like.
Hmm.
So, but I don't know what they would say. That would be a good question to ask. Questions? Thanks for pushing me. This is good. This is helpful because this is a new bit of research, and we'll see as things open up.
and you've got a manuscript.
Oh, I have a book on the environmental activists.
Yeah.
That's done.
Okay.
This is new.
Okay.
Yeah, the climate protests I just started. My book came out in 2017, so that's done. But a lot of the findings in the book, I'm curious to see how I mean, again, I was looking at mostly rural actions in forests, and now these are very urban, very different kind of protests to kind of see if, some of the same issues come up or don't come up. So, yeah, and I really got involved in it because I was sitting in a meeting, a really boring meeting with a bunch of department chairs on my campus, and I heard this drumming out the window. I was like, what is that drumming going on? Someone said, oh, it was Friday. It was a climate strike. It was the high school students and the college students. They walked out of class and they were marching through campus with the drumming and chanting. So I left the meeting and went down, just followed the march with them around the campus. So that was sort of the beginning. And that was this sort of idea of the kind of interruption of daily life and the sort of, rupture, intervention of the social structures.
Does anyone know how the high school climate protests are actually strong in the Czech Republic?
Yeah, I wondered about that.
No?
I think
They are very strong.
Yeah.
They're holding to the, I think it's next, this Friday, it's this Friday.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
they're
fantastic.
holding-
I wish I was going to be
I
here.
think it's all around the Republic.
I gotta watch the
Here in
news.
Prague especially,
Interesting.
so I think they're pretty strong.
So it's starting up again. I haven't seen it starting up again in the US because of COVID. I think you are a little farther along in terms of people congregating outside.
We're pre-election time, so
Yeah.
no one's closing anything, and once the elections get done, then I think it's going to change.
Yeah. So I don't think high school students in California are going, I mean, I haven't seen any, I'd be curious to see, but it's interesting to know that, thank you. So, yeah, there you go. What about college students?
Yeah, some will join, but it's
Yeah.
not as a big of a movement here.
Yet.
Yet.
Of course.
Why do you think the high school students more than the college students?
Well, I think they were trying to join, like the college students were trying to join, and trying to like connect with, but they were just not so successful.
Huh.
They were not successful to activize.
Enough people.
Enough people. I don't know why.
Huh.
There was like a climate strike, I think, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Here at the faculty at the university. And it was quite controversial. And I think it was like the last big event, and then like.
Was the faculty not supportive? Was that part of why it was controversial?
I think it was quite controversial. Yeah, they're not so supportive,
Yeah.
but there was just a whole lot of factors going into it. So
There may be more at stake for college students than high school students.
yeah.
Maybe more dangerous for college
So I mean, it was in the building. So
Yeah, right.
So there was like a whole lot of factors, and they wanted to speak over and so on.
Ah, interesting, thank you.
And they did in the end, right?
Yeah, they did. They did.
Yeah.
It was,
So did you see it?
Yeah, we took,
Yeah.
I mean, we reflected on it in the class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were
There was a whole
everywhere.
like, lectures the whole day,
Yeah.
and like, I was here. I think it was okay, but there was a couple of things like with the professors and then with the school. But I think in the end it was fine. Yeah, that was the only big event.
All right, just where do you plan to take the research now? Like, do you have a plan for, it's difficult, as you said, it's difficult to sort of
Yeah,
juggle all the pandemic
right.
balls at the same time.
Yeah, I'm not really sure because I have another research project that I'm working on right now that's about post-wildfire apocalypse rituals, memorial rituals, and restoration rituals after catastrophic wildfires in California. So I'm kind of working on that now. It's a little bit easier because it's outside, small groups. So we'll see. So I'm not really sure. I want to spend more time with the Red Rebel Brigade. I want to participate. I haven't done any costume, I've gone to climate protests, but I haven't participated in terms of costume. I mean, I need to have that experience and hang out with people and do more deep ethnographic work. I haven't done that yet. So I would like to do that. I'm not sure when and how that's going to happen. But I'm kind of waiting to see as things open up. And if it sounds like, I mean, I'm glad to hear here it's kind of going back. And I've seen some other signs of it starting to come up again, but not so much in California and maybe some other places in the US, but I don't think so. I think we're still in a very, we're not doing so well in terms of our cases. So, yeah, so I don't know. We'll see.
I wanted to tell you one thing. If you remember from my presentation about the Fastnacht, there was a moment when Jana was talking about it. Suddenly, when the framework is lost, some people who do normally can't only participate, and we have seen the people lying on the ground.
Right.
And this were extinction rebellion.
Yeah.
So they normally are not able, but they somehow use this framework of Fastnacht to suddenly to make their protest in the days of Fastnacht in the streets, and like using all their symbols and so on.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have some other images of that?
Yes, sure. Because the
Like to
students of
see.
mine, they were
Yeah.
making as well interviews
Yeah.
with them, so I can send you as well the interviews.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. I'd really like to hear more about it.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions?
I'm really curious about this Red Brigade. I don't know if
Yeah,
you
me
talked
too.
about it before.
Yeah.
I came, but like there's one particular name behind it? It's some...
Yeah, Doug Francisco. He's based in the UK, and they started this. I think the performance group itself dates back to the 1990s, and maybe even the red part, but I'm not sure about that yet. But so they were the ones that kind of first started it, and then they just, encouraged people around the world to. I mean, I know it's been in the US, other parts of Europe, but I'm not sure how much it's spread beyond that. But yeah, I have a lot more to find out. So I know that it started in the UK and that it's spreading and that they've been really open about, is they want people to maintain the silence and kind of the aesthetic of it. But beyond that, I think they've kind of just let, it hasn't been like a copyright issue or anything that I know of yet. but I'm kind of curious to see if it does, because as it spreads, it may take shape differently in other cultural contexts, and will that be an issue for the founders? I don't know. So yeah, still much to see what happens.
Actually, I've been Radek talking about his work on this Leon Chvilek. He was doing recently. We didn't talk about this in the discussion. Just because there is a big movement now, political movement, and Radek was there as some kind of ritual specialist who tried to help them to make protests more ritual.
Yeah,
and
right.
not so just protesting, because if you make normally, as you see, if you make a protest, the reaction of the audience is mostly very negative.
Right.
And if you are successful in shifting it a little bit further and doing more ritual symbols and so on, so it's much better for the media, for the people to understand it and
Less
so
confrontational.
Yeah. And so this was actually, I find it amazing that Radek's role was there, like
As the ritual
organizers to make more ritualized.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. I have seen that ritual scholars being involved in other contexts, but I haven't seen that yet, at least in the US with the protests. But I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I do wonder about the Red Rebel Brigade, if they have consulted with any, or because one thing I have seen was they've read some ritual studies material, but it'd be interesting to know if they have consulted with them, and I don't know the answer to that.
And I think it can be really the role that religious studies students might have for this course.
Just send them out as ritual specialists for protests.
About what you are doing,
Yeah.
and use the things we have been studying. And actually, it's very logical. So.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting potential for that. I mean, I know when I was doing it with what?
Protest design.
Protest design,
And
absolutely.
actually, the switch from protest making then ritual making.
Yeah.
Not just to protest, but think in
Kind of
the
shift
context.
the protest to
And
something
I think
else.
in which this movement Radek was working was very successful, actually. That they were able to communicate much better than other protests, because they were thinking different concepts. I think I don't know if you like to say better than I did.
Well, it's a huge topic, so it's difficult to say just a little bit about it. But there was basically a tension between this protest aspect, which is sort of easier to get through. It's easier to make people excited about protesting.
Yeah.
But it's not the kind of emotion that we wanted them to take home with them. We wanted to make use of this protest energy and to transform it into a different kind of emotion, into some kind of constructive power.
So they take home something else. Yeah.
So the task of these performances was to start with this protesting energy and to gradually transform it into something else.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Also, like, make it sustainable, really, like, long time going motivation for people to take part and to be active. That's what I really feel is the difference between this initiative and other political movements or aspirations.
So they take home something that is going to continue, rather than just this exciting moment when they were out in the streets. How do you shift that? What was the idea to shift from this? How did that work? I mean, what did you do to make that effective? Or what did they do?
Well, it's difficult to explain. Basically, there was a series of speeches and songs and performances, and it lasted for 2 hours.
Yeah.
and gradually the energy was changing, the mood was changing.
So the mood was shaped
messages
intentionally
were
through
changing,
those.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's really interesting. When was this?
In the fall of 2019 was the last one.
So just before the pandemic.
Yeah, so kind of the same time all these climate protests were happening. But this was a political.
There were 200,000 participants.
That's huge. And did you do any follow-up research to find out sort of, well, the pandemic? Yeah, I guess not.
Actually on the 17th of November, or like 16th, but they timed it around the date. So I was like saying that's when everything happened here.
Right.
It's huge.
I guess.
Well, I think we're going to have a 2,000 strong protest anytime soon, but.
Yeah, so you had the momentum kind of coming out of that, but then of course now you kind of have to start again.
It dissipated, you know, yeah.
But it's interesting to speculate what would have happened if the pandemic hadn't. Yeah.
But for me, it's really great to hear the way you are thinking about that those protests and the connection with the rituals and this perspective. I think it's really worth to have to understand what's happening, like when people go and do some kind of activity. And I still think for me that it should have actually some real impact.
Yeah.
That's not to think about how it works as a ritual, but how to improve the ritual side. And as well to work with the expectations of people, that if they do this, if this is a ritual, it means you don't need to achieve something right now, or that 100,000 people will be now baptized because of this, but that the efficiency is maybe in some change in the thinking of the people, or that they get interest, not that they just hate it because you disturb their holidays, but how to do it. And I think if the organizers would really work with this, this is a ritual, or this is a more symbolic happening, not the direct protest, they would achieve maybe much more. Yeah. And maybe they could as well change the way how they do it, not just lying from the cars, but somehow maybe with the humor. And so this is what we try to do in the Velvet Carnival, to change the thinking. How to make this. It could have some real impact, which would be interesting for me. How if you would work with such a group, if this would change the way they do it, or they think about it, and how it might change the audience watching this.
Yeah, I mean, I really love the idea of people that study ritual getting involved with the planning. I mean, it isn't something that I had really, I have done it on a very small scale, but I'm really curious to hear about that.
Or you come to and work with some group and other kind. This is actually what we do. That we try to work with the groups from the make this shift from protest to a ritual expression.
Okay, at one point we were doing a political mourning ritual, which was a commemoration on the 21st of August, which is the date of the Russian invasion in 1968. But this was not in memory of the 21st of August of 1968, but 1969, when there were huge protests in Prague against the Russian situation, and these were brutally suppressed, and 5 people were killed. And we were doing a ritual funeral of these five people who have been completely forgotten. Most people don't remember them. So we tried to bring them back to memory, and to do a public funeral for them. But it was done at the same time as those huge demonstrations, so it was a public funeral with like 15,000 people attending.
Wow. Yeah.
And I can show you.
Like this. Let's see. Like what the funeral consisted of. So what year was this?
Also 2019.
Oh, yeah. And are the names on the caskets, the names of the victims?
Yeah, these are the names of the dead guys. And these are young people representing the dead guys.
So who organized this?
Again, this same organization, Million Moments for Democracy, who organized those huge demonstrations.
Oh, that's really interesting. What is the, what's on their shirts?
It's the target, because they became
Got it.
the
The
targets
victims,
of
Right.
the soldiers who suppressed.
Ja, du willst sagen, was das Studentmäßig
And it's so many young people there who wouldn't have been around then, who are learning about this maybe for the first time. Look at that.
And lay down, and we.
Was this where it happened? The same place?
No, it's in front of the building of the Czech Communist Party.
Yeah. Well,
And we drew their silhouettes.
Yeah.
So when they got up, the
silhouettes were there. Oh, that's fantastic.
And then all the participants took a piece of chalk and they drew their feet. So there remained 15,000 feet silhouettes on the ground as well when the thing was finished. And then we did a funeral march. First of all, took place where some of these people were actually shot, and where at that very day a monument was erected after 50 years. And then we transformed the mourning energy into the protest energy, and we marched to the Prague castle, and so the atmosphere entirely changed, and
that was intentionally
excited
shifted.
and full of energy and full of drumming and so on.
Well, I thought, so you started with the mourning and then went to the protest.
Yeah,
kind of
this time it was inverted.
Yeah.
And then there were just two speeches in front of the castle. I myself had a speech about the healing of national traumas.
Oh. Thank you so much for sharing that. I had no idea. That's a great example of that. I mean, just this sort of, I'm interested in public mourning rituals, so we just had ours for September 11th.
And in devising it, I followed the frequent structure of funerals, because what happens in funerals is that frequently there is, first of all, the sad phase. But at the end, it sort of transforms into this life-affirming phase.
That's really true.
So we try to effect the same transformation in this kind of funeral.
With a huge number of people. That's really interesting.
I will just officially end it now. And,
Okay.
and we can show you, maybe we can show Sarah's the 25,000 crosses as well, because that is something.
I'd love to see that.
well, I'm just officially going to end it for,
Okay.
for this
Okay.
streaming.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
if anyone needs to leave, please don't feel bad to leave right now. But you're welcome to stay. And this was also interesting.
So fascinating to me. I mean, these other examples, I mean, because in the Oslo research project, these are